And here it is, week 3. And if I begin every video with, here it is, week 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm a creature of habit. What can I say? Now, I note in the announcement below that 3 is a sacred number in many cultures, and I've never heard a satisfactory explanation as to why 3 is so important, but there are other numbers that are also important, and they're easier to understand, and I explain about 5 and 7. Now, 3 we see reflected in many triads in many cultures. In Christianity, there is the Trinity, but in Greek myth, there are the 3 fates. In Norse myth, there are the Norns. There are sometimes 3 Furies and sometimes more than 3 Furies in Greek myth. Cerberus usually has 3 heads, but he also has as many as 50. But 3, again, is repeated in various cultures, as is 7. And it goes back to why. You make up your own decision about that. This week, we're going to be continuing to examine archetypal myth. And the myths that we are going to look at are myths of the flood, destruction in general, but most particularly the flood. And one of the emphasis will be this week on how science and myth intersect. Now remember, Campbell's cosmological explanation or function, not explanation, but function of myth has to do with myth being a type of early science. It was used to explain natural phenomena that our ancestors didn't understand. So when Persephone was kidnapped and taken into the underworld, Demeter mourned, and as the goddess of the earth and nature, earth mourned with her, and the first winter occurred. We saw this beginning, though, in Sumeria and Babylon with the myths of Inanna and Sumeria and her counterpart Ishtar in Babylon, when they make their descents into the underworld for various reasons, and I'm not going to go into those. But they descended into the underworld, and as goddesses of fertility, when they were in the underworld, nothing was going on above ground. Plants were not blooming, babies weren't being conceived, and basically all fertility stopped. So this is how the ancients explained those aspects they didn't understand. And of course, there are other types of myth that deal with things other than the changes of the seasons. But again, that is the cosmological function of myth. Now, early science and myth. We're going to be looking at the floods. And the flood myth is one of the most prevalent myths throughout the world. I would not be surprised if there were beings on Mars, they wouldn't have a flood myth just because it's so prevalent on Earth. That's a joke, folks. I don't really believe that. The flood myth is found all over the world, and proponents of religious proponents often say that this is proof that a worldwide flood did occur, and that is not the case. Speaking from a secular point of view. In this module, we will examine, however, some events that could have occurred that did cause the flood myths to arise. Now, I'm not going to go over those because there are articles listed in the module for you to look at. One is the Black Sea theory. One is the rise of the oceans after the last glacial maximus retreated, and when all of those icebergs, glaciers melted, the sea level would have risen and would have engulfed local towns, which is also, are not towns because at that point there weren't towns, but this is also something that could occur when global warming takes place. Our coastal cities could be underwater. And in the Americas, there are also some other theories on why the myth might have arisen. And if we go back to the dispersion theory, if some of those Ice Age, Black Sea theories are true, are factual, then again, those myths would have been taken out with cultures that spread out all over the world. I'm not going to go into those more deeply because you're going to be reading about those, but I am going to talk about apocalypse myths. Now, in the text, there is the myth of Ragnarok, and Ragnarok is the destruction of the gods. Sometimes it's translated as twilight of the gods, but that's way too kind because it is the destruction of the gods. And when Ragnarok is approaching, according to the prose and poetic Eddas, and the poetic Eddas predate the prose Eddas, in the prose are just the poetic Eddas set in prose form. There are signs leading up to Ragnarok, and some of them are all morality will cease on the earth, and families will fight families. There will be 3 years of successive winters, no summer, no fall, no spring. Heimdall, the trumpeter of the gods, will blast out his horn, and this signals the battle which is to come. And the forces of good and the forces of evil will meet on a vast plain, and they will fight each other, and everybody dies. Everybody dies. I get the combatants mixed up, but I think Zeus kills Fenris, but Fenris kills Zeus. Odin kills Fenris, but Odin is still done in by a bite with the wolf Fenris and dies anyway. Thor fights Jormungand, the world's serpent, but he dies as well. And as a result of this, the 3 stages of the Norse cosmos that are in the world tree Yggdrasil, they collapse. There is a type of flood, and some people say this is the flood in Norse myth, and everything disappears. Now, the Prose Edda also says that the world is reborn, and there's a couple of myths that go along with that. One says that 2 humans actually hide in the roots of Yggdrasil, and that they repopulate the world much like Adam and Eve did, and other cultures did after the flood. And some say that Balder, whom Loki had Hod kill, is resurrected from the underworld, and he presides over this new world. I personally think that the versions that have the promise of rebirth and life after Ragnarok are later Christian additions, but I can't prove it, but I still think so. The Norse do not fight against their fate. In Greek myth, everybody fights against their faith. Oedipus's parents do. Priam of Troy does. But in Norse myth, they go, yeah, Ragnarok's coming, so let's have a good time while we're here. And when the big battle comes, we'll go down fighting, and yeah, we'll all die, but hey, that's the way it is. There are apocalypses throughout in other cultures. I was going to say throughout the world, but some cultures don't really have apocalypses in the sense that the Norse have apocalypse. In Greek myth, you have the 5 stages of humans, and each successive stage is wiped out, and then a new one comes in. You also have this in Mayan and in Aztec myth, where there are different stages of humanity, or beings, creatures, not necessarily humans, that are wiped out, and one is by a flood, and then a new one arises. The Egyptians really didn't have an apocalyptic myth in the same sense as the Norse, and I think this was because the Egyptians thought their culture was never going to come to an end. I think that's also the same reason that they did not record their myths as did other cultures did. For example, Hesiod in Greece. There is no compilation of Egyptian myth. And I truly think it's because the Egyptians thought, hey, why write it down? Everybody knows it, and we're going to be around forever. And the Greeks, after the Olympians were instilled in Olympus, really didn't have an apocalypse myth either. Probably one of the other most famous apocalyptic myths is that of Christianity, whereas the armies of good and evil meet on a plain, this time Armageddon. There's a big battle, and evil and Satan are defeated, and a new kingdom on earth is established, a new heaven and a new earth, and that's it. Well, that's not it, but that's all I'm going to go into. Other cultures have other types of apocalyptic myths. Humans are fascinated with apocalypses. Since Christianity has been instituted, there have been cases of where people say, the end of the world is coming, you better get ready. And in some cases, people have even hunkered down and waited for it, and it's never happened. It has happened even in the 20th century. Now, in the 21st century, there have also been Christian evangelicals who have said, the end is coming, the world is going to end here. But it hasn't so far. And if you remember 2012, everyone, not everyone, because I certainly didn't think this. There were many people who believed that the world was going to come to an end, or at least humanity as we know it was going to come to an end, because the Mayan calendar ended in 2012. My take on that was, if the Mayans knew that the world was going to end in 2012, wouldn't they have known that the Europeans were going to wipe out their civilization? Yeah. So the Mayans were misinterpreted and misrepresented, and they, from what I have read, I don't read Mayan script, but from what I have read about the experts, they say the Mayan writing doesn't say that at all. But back to our fascination with apocalypses. You all know, of course, that the world is going to end in, as we know it, in the zombie apocalypse. I mean, who doesn't know that? Even the CDC has a page on their website about what to do in the event of a zombie apocalypse. And of course, it's tongue-in-cheek. And they say that the reason why they have this is because actually preparing for the zombie apocalypse will help people prepare for earthquakes and other types of natural disasters. The zombie apocalypse has caught our attention, our fascination, and so far it is not letting go. And of course, we see this manifested in The Walking Dead. Now, The Walking Dead and other zombie movies and TV series are interesting because they manifest a true, real fear in humans. And it's not necessarily the end of the world. It is the fear of losing our autonomy and being controlled by government and perhaps even religion to a point where we have no control. And especially in The Walking Dead, we see this because the virus that infects the walkers was implanted by the CDC and the government. So this apocalypse echoes the real fears of modern humans, whereas the apocalypse of the ancient days echoed their fears. Very interesting, and I'm not citing any of that I said, but I had a student at another school write a paper about the zombie apocalypse and these aspects, and it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating that our fears have been fed by this. I also want to point out about the zombie apocalypse that it shows how myths evolve with the zombies, using zombies as an example. The first reference to zombies, and they weren't called zombies, was in Sumeria with the goddess Ereshkigal, who had an affair with, and of course it's Nergal, it was Nergal, with a god of the upper world, Nergal, and she had gotten pregnant, and she wanted to marry Nergal, and the other god said, no, you can't, because he needs to be up here and you're down here. And she said, if you do not allow Nurgle to return to the underworld, because he had spent some time down there, and marry me, I will leash the dead upon the living, and they will outnumber the living, and they will eat the living. And if that isn't a zombie apocalypse, you tell me what is. The gods said, oh, we can't have that, and assented, and Ereshkigal and Nurgle were reunited. And then over the centuries, the idea of the zombies, which again were not called zombies, underwent different incarnations, and into the late 19th and 20th centuries, of course, the zombies were voodoo zombies. And again, that was the fear of a lack of control, because the voodoo master or mistress had control over those zombies. And there is some actual scientific backup for those types of zombies, because there's a drug, and the name of the drug escapes my mind right now. I would have to research it, and I can't do that right now. That would put people into a passive state and allow them to be controlled. But in the 1950s, Richard Matheson wrote a novella called I Am Legend. And I think this is the first time when the zombies and the people in Matheson's novel were kind of a combination of zombies and vampires. Perhaps they didn't drink blood, but they weren't quite man-eating, flesh-eating people as well. But that's not important, because the important aspect is, I think this is the first instance where this type of transformation in humans was attributed to a scientific cause, and it was a virus. And then, of course, we see I Am Legend. Many movies, or many, however many is many, several movies are based on this, including The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, that stays really close to the novella, but also The Omega Man with Charlton Heston. And then the latest one was the one with Will Smith, and it is titled I Am Legend, but it has nothing to do with the original, especially in that at the end of that movie, there's going to be a cure for this, and in the novella, there was no cure for it. These creatures were the new humans, and the title, I Am Legend, refers to the main character who has passed into the realm of legend and myth. He is the boogeyman. Now, I did not intend to get off on that, because it really doesn't have to do with destruction myths, but I went into the zombie apocalypse, and then I start free associating, and one thing goes to another. If you have an interest in this, there are certainly lots of things online that you can read about apocalypses and the zombie apocalypse, and there are other flood myths, and I will post some links to those. And again, below, there is the written information for the week, including the deliverables. And no, there is no discussion this week. You have 3 assignments. There is the quiz, the journal, and milestone 2. And I will post more on milestone 2 later. But there is no discussion, which I kind of miss that, because I like to talk about aspects. I'm going to stop rambling now, because this is way too long. It's almost 20 minutes. If you don't get to the end, you won't know that I'm saying this, but let's get on with it.